"Now it's my turn," said Jake, the groom, with a cold smile that didn't match the joy expected on a wedding day. I was standing behind a marble column in the ballroom of the Grand Plaza Hotel in Chicago, still processing the scene I had just witnessed. My wife of 8 years, Linda, was passionately kissing my brother-in-law Robert in the back garden, their elegant dresses crumpled against the stone wall. The groom's reaction to my desperate whisper about the betrayal I had just witnessed was not what I expected. No tears, no screams, no rush to confront the unfaithful couple. Just that calculating smile and those 4 words that made my blood run cold. My name is Chris, and at 42, I had just discovered that my seemingly perfect world was a carefully constructed lie. I had rushed over to Jake to warn him about his future wife and my brother-in-law, hoping to be the hero who would save the wedding before it was too late. But when I whispered in his ear what I had seen, Jake simply nodded as if confirming the weather forecast. There was no surprise, no pain. There was something much more disturbing: satisfaction. The hall was buzzing with 200 elegantly dressed guests, laughter echoing among the tables decorated with white and gold roses. My niece Sarah looked radiant in her wedding dress, greeting uncles and cousins who had traveled from across the country to be there. It was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. Linda had insisted that we arrive early, claiming she wanted to help with last-minute preparations. Now I understood why she was so anxious. And why Robert, the bride's brother and my brother-in-law for 15 years, had suggested that the 2 of us take a walk in the gardens to get some air. I had followed them discreetly, a strange intuition bothering me for weeks. Little things, whispered conversations that stopped when I entered the room, exchanged glances during family dinners, Linda coming home late with increasingly elaborate excuses about work meetings. What terrified me was not just discovering the betrayal. It was the way Jake was dealing with the information. As if he already knew. As if he had been waiting for this moment. "Jake, do you understand what I'm saying?" I insisted, my voice trembling. "Your fiancé is cheating on you with my brother-in-law. Right now, outside." He adjusted his tie with precise movements, his eyes scanning the room like a general assessing the battlefield before war. "I understand perfectly, Uncle Chris. And as I said, now it's my turn. If you find this story intriguing and want to discover what dark secret Jake is hiding, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to follow every twist and turn of this revenge that promises to shake all family structures. Because what happened next would turn Sarah's dream wedding into the most public and devastating nightmare our family had ever witnessed. Jake's words echoed in my mind as I tried to process his reaction. 8 years of marriage to Linda, 15 years of considering Robert a brother, and now I discovered that it was all just an elaborate hoax. "Jake, I don't understand," I whispered, grabbing his arm. "Your fiancé is cheating on you, and you're acting like it's part of the plan." He gently pulled away, adjusting his shirt cuffs with the precision of someone who had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. "Uncle Chris, you've always been the most honorable man in the family. That's exactly why I need you to stay quiet and watch. What you saw out there is just the tip of a much bigger iceberg." My mind raced. Jake had a degree in business administration from Northwestern and had built a consulting firm from scratch at the age of 28. He wasn't the kind of man who would passively accept betrayal. There was something calculated in his movements, something that made me feel like I was just another piece on a board that I couldn't see completely. "How long have you known?" I asked, my voice coming out hoarser than I intended. 3 months, he replied without hesitation. "Since I hired a private investigator to look into some financial inconsistencies at Robert's company. I discovered that he was not only embezzling money from clients, but also using Sarah as access to privileged family information." The world seemed to tilt beneath my feet. Robert wasn't just a respected accountant in Chicago, he managed the finances of half our extended family. My parents, my in-laws, even my younger sister had entrusted their retirement savings to him. What about Linda? I asked, already fearing the answer. Jake pulled out his phone and showed me a series of photographs. Linda and Robert in an intimate restaurant, entering an apartment I didn't recognize together, signing documents in an office that was definitely not his. The last photo showed the 2 of them leaving a bank, and Linda was carrying a briefcase that I recognized immediately. It was where we kept all our important documents. They're not just having an affair, Chris. They're systematically draining the entire family's accounts. The apartment you saw in the photos? It's in the name of a shell company they created. The documents? They're property transfers that Linda signed using her marital power of attorney. I felt bile rising in my throat. Linda had full access to my accounts, to the house I inherited from my grandfather, to the investments I had built up over 15 years as a civil engineer. If she had used the power of attorney I had naively given her when I went to work abroad for 6 months, she could have transferred everything. How much? I managed to ask. From what my investigator has been able to track down so far, about $2,300,000. Your accounts, your parents' accounts, my parents' accounts, and a trust account my grandmother left to Sarah. The number hit me like a punch in the stomach. It wasn't just my future that was being stolen, but that of my entire family. My 72-year-old parents had saved every penny during 40 years of hard work. Sarah's trust account was to pay for her medical school. And you decided to let the wedding go ahead anyway? I asked, incredulous. Jake's smile became even colder. Chris, you still don't get it. Today isn't just my wedding day. It's the day they're going to find out they messed with the wrong family. I looked around the elegant hall. The guests were chatting animatedly, oblivious to the drama unfolding. Linda had returned from the garden and was now greeting aunts and cousins with the same warm smile that had fooled me for 8 years. Robert was at her side, his hand occasionally touching her back in a gesture that I now realized was laden with intimacy. What are you going to do? I whispered. Jake checked his watch, a Rolex I had never seen before. In exactly 15 minutes, the FBI will walk through that door. They have arrest warrants for Linda and Robert for bank fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. In 20 minutes, all the guests will know exactly what kind of people they really are. My blood ran cold. The FBI. When I discovered the scheme, I didn't go to the local police. I went straight to the feds. Fraud that crosses state lines, international money laundering, use of banking institutions for organized crime. They were very interested. Jake looked directly into my eyes, and for the first time that day, I saw something other than cold calculation. I saw pain. You know what the hardest part was, Uncle Chris? Finding out that my own fiancée had been involved from the beginning. Sarah isn't an innocent victim being manipulated. She's the architect of the whole plan. The floor seemed to disappear beneath my feet. Sarah, my 26-year-old niece, whom I had watched grow up since she was a baby. The sweet girl who always hugged me tightly on birthdays, who called me for career advice, who I had helped choose her wedding dress just 3 months ago. That's impossible, I murmured. That's why it worked for so long, Jake replied. No one suspects the radiant bride planning her honeymoon in the Cayman Islands. No one questions why she needs access to family documents to plan a special surprise for all of us. But as Jake revealed the extent of the betrayal that would destroy our family forever, he had no idea that I myself had discovered something about him 3 weeks earlier. Something that would completely change who the predator really was in this story. The revelation about Sarah hit me like a hammer to the chest. 26 years of watching that girl grow up, from her first steps to her business degree graduation. I had taken her fishing when she was 8, taught her to drive at 16, helped her with her first job interviews. I don't believe it, I muttered, feeling the ground shift beneath my feet. Sarah wouldn't do that. You're wrong. Jake pulled out his phone again, this time showing a WhatsApp conversation. The messages were between Sarah and Robert, dated 2 months ago. My niece was discussing the transfer of Uncle Chris's account, and asking if Jake was still buying the whole story. They were talking about me as if I were a naive child. She suggested Linda should feign more sexual interest to keep me distracted, Jake continued, his voice emotionless. Apparently, I was asking too many questions about her nighttime absences. I felt bile rise in my throat. Linda had radically changed our intimate behavior in recent weeks, being more affectionate and initiating things she had rejected for years. I had interpreted it as a second honeymoon. In fact, it was calculated manipulation. The original plan was to marry Sarah, gain legal access to all the family accounts as son-in-law, and then she would fake my death in an accident, Jake said as if reading a weather report. Robert had already identified a $500,000 life insurance policy my parents had taken out on me. Linda would be the devastated widow of her deceased brother, Sarah would be the young widow in mourning, and Robert would be the trusted accountant helping the family through the tragedy. The wedding around us continued its elegant dance of feigned happiness. Uncles laughing, cousins hugging, my parents chatting animatedly with Jake's parents about plans for future grandchildren. No one imagined we were planning arrests in the middle of the celebration. Jake, I managed to say, my voice hoarse. You said the FBI is coming. How can you be so sure? Because I didn't just uncover the scheme, Chris. I infiltrated it. He adjusted his tie again, but now I realized it was a nervous gesture, not one of confidence. 3 months ago, when my investigator brought me the first evidence, I could have gone straight to the police. But the evidence was circumstantial. Linda and Robert could claim it was legitimate authorization, that you and other family members agreed to the transfers. So you decided to continue with the engagement, I concluded. Continue and participate, he corrected. I pretended I knew nothing. I let Sarah think she was manipulating me. I pretended to be in love enough to sign the documents she asked for, open the accounts she suggested. Jake pulled a small digital recorder from his inside jacket pocket. Every conversation, every confession, every instruction on how to kill my own father to access his offshore account. All recorded, all documented. I looked at the tiny recorder with a mixture of admiration and horror. Jake had spent 3 months of his life pretending to love a woman who was planning to murder him. He had endured caresses from someone who saw his death as a logistical problem. You're braver than I am, I admitted. Or stupider, he replied. There were nights I woke up wondering if she had put something in my food, if the strange smell in my apartment was gas leaking on purpose. But as Jake revealed the extent of his counterintelligence plan, I finally found the courage to share what I had discovered 3 weeks earlier. That information completely changed our perception of who the real predators were in this story. Jake, I need to tell you something, I interrupted. Something I found out about you 3 weeks ago. He looked at me with genuine curiosity for the first time that afternoon. About me. Your private investigator wasn't the first one you hired, was he? I asked, watching his reaction. You've been investigating our family for much longer than 3 months. The smile disappeared from his face. In fact, I continued, feeling a strange calm come over me, you started investigating our family the moment you met Sarah. 2 years ago. Jake swallowed hard. Chris, I don't know what you're talking about. Your real name isn't Jake Morrison, it's Jacob Morales, I said, watching the shock cross his eyes. You're the son of Ricardo Morales, the man who destroyed Sarah's father's company 15 years ago. The noise of the party continued around us, but between us there was a deadly silence. You came to Chicago specifically to take revenge on the family that, in your mind, destroyed your father, I continued. Sarah wasn't manipulating you. You were manipulating her. Jake closed his eyes for a long moment. When he opened them, all pretense was gone. How did you find out? 3 weeks ago, my company received a proposal for a construction project in Milwaukee. The client was asking for specific references about my work on the demolition of the Morales commercial complex 15 years ago, I explained. I thought it was strange that someone would remember such an old project, so I did some research. Jake nodded slowly. I discovered that Ricardo Morales had a son who disappeared after the bankruptcy. A son who changed his name and built a new identity. A son who had sworn to destroy the Miller family for cheating his father in a deal that led to his ruin. My father wasn't perfect, Jake said finally, his voice low. But he didn't deserve to lose everything. You knew he was desperate. You knew he'd sign any contract. Sarah's father tricked him on purpose. And now you're using the same playbook, I replied. Seducing a woman to gain access to the family, manipulating emotions for financial gain. Jake stared at me for a long moment. The difference, Chris, is that I'm doing this to people who deserve it. That's when I realized there were no heroes in this story. Just different levels of revenge. And as Jake and I revealed our secret cards to each other, neither of us noticed that Linda and Robert had disappeared from the room. The real game was just beginning, and we were all about to discover that the most elaborate avengers aren't always the ones who win in the end. The revelation of Jake's true identity hung between us like toxic smoke. 2 men who had spent the last few minutes staring each other down as adversaries now had to decide whether they were enemies or temporary allies in the face of a greater threat. Where are Linda and Robert? I asked, scanning the room with my eyes. The party continued as usual, but my wife and brother-in-law had evaporated as if they had never existed. Jake checked his watch again, but this time with a worried expression. They should be here. The FBI won't arrive for another 12 minutes. Unless someone tipped them off, I replied, feeling a chill settle in my stomach. Jake pulled out his phone and made a quick call. I heard fragments of a tense conversation. Yes, they left through the back parking lot. A black van. No, we didn't get the license plate number. When he hung up, his expression had hardened completely. My investigator was watching all the exits. Linda and Robert left 5 minutes ago in a vehicle he'd never seen before. Someone tipped them off, I concluded. Someone who knew about your operation with the FBI. Impossible, Jake replied, but there was uncertainty in his voice. Only my lawyer, the investigator, and the federal agents knew about the plan. That's when it hit me like a bolt of lightning. Jake, you said Sarah was orchestrating everything. That she had been manipulating you for months. Yes, but she's here, receiving congratulations, he replied, pointing across the hall where Sarah was smiling radiantly in her wedding dress. Exactly. She's here pretending she knows nothing, while Linda and Robert are on the run, I explained. You said you recorded conversations of her planning your death. Could she have recorded conversations of you as well? Jake's face paled. My apartment. She had the keys. She said she wanted to leave some things there for after the honeymoon. She planted listening devices, I added. Sarah knew about your whole plan from the beginning. She warned them to run away before the FBI arrived. Jake began typing furiously on his phone. I need to cancel the operation. If Linda and Robert aren't here when the agents arrive, they'll suspect a leak. The whole investigation could be compromised. Wait, I said, grabbing his arm. You're thinking the way they want you to think. What do you mean? Sarah wants you to cancel the operation. She wants you to panic and ruin your own investigation, I explained, the pieces falling into place in my mind. But what if we don't cancel? What if we let the FBI arrive and find only Sarah here? Jake looked at me with a mixture of confusion and interest. Go on. Think about it. Linda and Robert ran away, but Sarah stayed. She can't just disappear from her own wedding without raising suspicion. So she's betting you'll panic and call it off. But without Linda and Robert, we have no arrests. Just a bride at her wedding, Jake objected. But we have something better, I replied, remembering something I had seen earlier. We have Sarah alone and unprotected, without her partners to help her keep up the story. And you said you have recordings of her confessing everything. Jake nodded slowly. The recordings are enough for an arrest. And without Linda and Robert to coordinate their stories, Sarah will have to improvise. And people who improvise make mistakes. We looked across the hall at Sarah, who continued to greet guests with her perfect smile. She occasionally glanced in our direction, trying to look casual, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. There's something else, Jake said after a moment. Something I didn't tell you about my plan for revenge. What? I didn't just come to destroy your family because of my father, Jake admitted. I came because I discovered that my father wasn't cheated in a bad deal. He was deliberately sabotaged. I felt the air rush out of my lungs. Sabotaged how? Forged documents, contracts altered after signing, witnesses bribed, Jake listed. Someone wanted Morales to fail. Someone who benefited directly from our downfall. And you think it was someone in our family? I don't think so. I know so. Jake showed me a folder he had taken from inside his jacket. I have the evidence. Original contracts, recordings of conversations, bank transfers. Everything points to Robert. The world seemed to spin around me. Robert. 15 years ago, Robert wasn't just an accountant. He worked briefly for the firm that brokered the deal between my father and Sarah's father. He had access to all the documents, all the negotiations. But why would he do that? Because Robert had already been planning to steal from the Miller family for 15 years, Jake explained. Destroying my family was just a dress rehearsal. A way to practice his manipulation and fraud skills before the real target. The complexity of what I was discovering made me dizzy. Robert wasn't just an unfaithful brother-in-law who had gotten involved with my wife. He was a calculating predator who had destroyed an entire family just to perfect his theft techniques. So what do we do now? I asked. Jake looked at Sarah once more, then back at me. Now we do something she doesn't expect. Instead of enemies fighting for revenge, we become allies fighting for justice. What about the FBI? They'll still be here in 8 minutes. But instead of arresting Linda and Robert, they'll arrest Sarah. And instead of just bank fraud, they'll arrest her for conspiracy, premeditated murder, and international money laundering. If you're following this insane twist and want to know how two betrayed men managed to turn a wedding into an operation of justice, subscribe to the channel, because what happened when the FBI raided the ballroom was beyond any movie script. Because Sarah had underestimated one crucial thing. When you make two intelligent men discover that they have been manipulated by the same network of criminals, you don't create enemies. You create a dangerous alliance. I looked at Jake, my former enemy who had just become my improvised ally, and nodded. Then let's do it. Jake pulled the small digital recorder from his pocket and checked that it was working. Sarah doesn't know I have recordings of her confessing everything. She thinks only Linda and Robert are at risk. What about the evidence about her father? I asked, still processing the complexity of the situation. It goes with the rest, Jake replied. Robert destroyed my family as a practice. Now he's going to pay for rehearsal and the main event. The hall around us continued its dance of feigned happiness. Sarah greeted distant aunts, posed for photos with bridesmaids, perfectly playing the role of the radiant bride. But I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes occasionally scanned the exits. She's nervous, I observed. Probably wondering why Linda and Robert haven't sent a signal yet that they're safe. Then let's turn up the pressure, Jake said, starting to walk toward the center of the hall. Showtime. Jake made his way to the small stage where the band was playing background music. He took the microphone from the lead singer with the confidence of someone accustomed to commanding situations. Everyone, may I have your attention for a moment? His voice echoed through the sound system. The hall gradually fell silent, 200 heads turning in his direction. Sarah, who was chatting with cousins at the back of the hall, visibly paled. As the groom, I'd like to make a special toast before the official ceremony, Jake continued, his smile perfectly calibrated. To my beautiful bride Sarah, who always knew exactly what she wanted out of life. Polite applause echoed through the hall. Sarah forced a smile, but her hands trembled slightly as she held her champagne glass. Sarah always told me that true love was about total honesty, Jake continued, his eyes fixed on his bride. About sharing everything with each other. No secrets. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 5 degrees. The more perceptive guests began to realize that something was going on, but they couldn't quite put their finger on what it was. So honey, Jake turned directly to Sarah, I thought you'd want to know that Robert and Linda didn't make it to the airport. Sarah's smile froze completely. Her champagne glass trembled in her hand. Actually, Jake continued, his voice still sweet but with a hint of steel, they're being escorted back here right now. By the FBI. A collective murmur rippled through the room. Guests exchanged confused glances, wondering if this was some kind of elaborate joke. Sarah dropped her glass. The crystal shattered against the marble floor with a sound that echoed like a gunshot in the sudden silence. Jake, her voice came out as a strangled whisper. What are you talking about? I'm talking about bank fraud, my dear, Jake replied, stepping down from the stage and walking slowly toward her. I'm talking about $2,300,000 stolen from our family. I'm talking about murder plans recorded in your own voice. The hall exploded with shocked whispers. Elderly relatives leaned on chairs, young cousins pulled out phones to record, and I saw my own parents in the corner, their faces pale with incomprehension. You're crazy, Sarah stammered, backing away. I don't know what you're talking about. You're having some kind of nervous breakdown. Nervous breakdown? Jake laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Sarah, you recorded our conversations for 3 months. Did you think I wouldn't do the same? He held up the small digital recorder. Would you like to hear the recording from last Thursday, when you described in detail how you were going to make my death look like a car accident? Or would you prefer the one from Tuesday, when you and Robert discussed how to divide the life insurance money? The blood drained completely from Sarah's face. She looked desperately around the room, searching for a way out, an explanation, anything. Or, Jake continued, his voice growing colder, we could discuss how you recruited Linda to seduce Uncle Chris 8 years ago, specifically to gain access to his accounts. All eyes turned to me. I felt the weight of 200 pairs of eyes, but I kept my posture straight. It's true, I confirmed in a clear voice. Linda never loved me. It was all a manipulation orchestrated by my own niece. My sister, Sarah's mother, let out a muffled cry and leaned on her husband. Sarah, that can't be true. Mom, they're lying, Sarah protested, fake tears beginning to roll down her cheeks. They're trying to ruin me. Jake found out about my prenup plans and is making up these crazy stories. That's when the double doors of the hall burst open. 6 federal agents in dark suits entered information, their FBI badges clearly visible. Behind them, in handcuffs, came Linda and Robert. Linda was even paler than Sarah, her elegant dress crumpled and stained. Robert had a cut on his lip and stared at the floor. The lead agent, a tall man with gray hair, scanned the room with professional eyes before addressing Sarah directly. Sarah Miller, his voice cut through the silence like a knife. You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit bank fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit murder. Sarah tried to run. In her wedding dress and high heels, she stumbled after 3 steps and fell heavily to the floor. 2 female agents calmly approached and helped her to her feet, cuffing her as she sobbed. You don't understand, Sarah cried as she was escorted away. I'm the victim here. They manipulated me. Jake forced me to do all of this. Señorita Miller, the lead officer replied patiently, we have 47 recordings of you planning crimes. Some date back 2 years, long before you met Senor Morrison. Sorry, Senor Morales. Jake didn't move when the agent used his real name. He simply watched as Sarah was led out of the hall, her dress train dragging across the floor. That's when Sarah stopped at the door and turned to face him one last time. You think you've won? She shouted, her sweet bride mask finally slipping completely. You're just as pathetic as your failed father. At least I had the courage to go after what I wanted, instead of crying for 15 years over spilled milk. The silence that followed was deafening. Jake walked calmly to where Sarah stood among the agents. Sarah, he said softly, there's a difference between courage and cruelty. You were never courageous. You were always just cruel. Then he turned to the lead agent. Agent Matthews, the evidence of Robert's crimes 15 years ago is in the folder I left in your office yesterday. All documented, verified, and ready for further prosecution. As Sarah was finally escorted out, the room remained in absolute shock. Entire families who had lost their savings, relationships destroyed by betrayal, lives ruined by greed. But as I watched Jake receive hesitant congratulations from some family members and suspicious glances from others, I realized that our improvised alliance had created something unexpected, not just justice, but a strange understanding that sometimes the most unlikely enemies can become the most effective allies. What none of us expected was to discover that Sarah, Linda, and Robert's arrest was only the first act of a much larger revelation that would forever change our understanding of who we really were as a family. 6 months later, the federal court in Chicago was packed for what the newspapers called the most complex family fraud case of the decade. Linda, Robert, and Sarah sat side by side at the defendant's table, their elegant clothes replaced by orange prison uniforms. The prosecutor presented evidence that revealed the true scale of the operation. It wasn't just $2.3 million stolen from our family. It was a scheme that spanned 15 years, involving dozens of families in 3 different states. Robert had used his position as an accountant to identify wealthy families. Then Sarah and Linda would infiltrate them as girlfriends, fiancées, or close friends. The scheme began when defendant Sarah Miller was only 11 years old, explained the prosecutor. Robert Miller systematically trained her to seduce and manipulate wealthy men. Linda Patterson was recruited at age 21 specifically to marry Christopher Miller and gain access to his finances. Sitting in the gallery, I watched Linda throughout the testimony. She showed no remorse or regret. Occasionally she whispered something to her lawyer, but most of the time she stared straight ahead, as if watching a movie about someone else's life. The most shocking revelation came when the FBI presented recordings of Sarah at 16, already practicing psychological manipulation techniques on her high school boyfriends. Robert had meticulously documented everything, creating a file of case studies to perfect her skills. My niece wasn't just a criminal, I whispered to Jake during a break. She was a sociopath trained since childhood. Jake nodded grimly. What scares me is how she almost managed to completely fool me. If I hadn't discovered the connection to my father. The trial lasted 3 weeks. 42 victims from other states testified, each telling similar stories of manipulation and theft. A 73-year-old widow from Kentucky lost her family home. A young entrepreneur from Denver had his startup destroyed. An entire family in Texas was forced into bankruptcy. When it came time for sentencing, the federal judge showed no mercy. Robert received 25 years for leading a criminal organization. Linda was sentenced to 15 years for fraud and conspiracy. Sarah, despite her age, received 20 years due to the extent of her involvement and the calculated nature of her crimes. The court finds it particularly disturbing, the judge stated, that defendant Miller began committing these crimes while still a minor, demonstrating a pattern of predatory behavior that developed over more than a decade. Sarah finally broke down when she heard her sentence. She cried for the first time throughout the entire process, but not out of remorse. She screamed that it was unfair, that Robert had forced her to do everything, that she was a victim of circumstance. No one believed her. After the trial, Jake and I had coffee at a diner near the courthouse. Our improvised alliance had turned into something resembling genuine friendship, built on the mutual recognition that we had both been pieces in a game bigger than we had imagined. "So what are you going to do now?" I asked. "Go back to Milwaukee and rebuild," he replied. "My consulting firm survived the scandal, but I need to prove that I can operate with complete integrity. What about you?" I looked out the window at the streets of Chicago, the city where I was born and raised, where I had built my career as a civil engineer, where I had been systematically robbed by people I considered family. "I'm going to rebuild too," I replied. "But not here." 3 months later, I was driving west on Interstate 80, my Jeep loaded with all that remained of my previous life. The FBI had recovered about 60% of the stolen money through offshore accounts and properties the trio had purchased. It wasn't everything, but it was enough to start over. I chose Denver, a city where no one knew my story, where I could just be Chris Miller, civil engineer, without the layers of trauma and betrayal that had accumulated over 8 years of fraudulent marriage. The first project I took on was overseeing the construction of a community center for victims of domestic abuse. Irony of fate, or perhaps it was exactly the kind of work I needed to do to process my own experience. During the first few weeks, I worked 15 hours a day, losing myself in the technical details of foundations and structures. But gradually I began to realize that healing would come not only from hard work, but from reconnecting with parts of myself that I had lost during years of subtle manipulation. I started hiking in the Rocky Mountains on weekends, something I had always wanted to try but Linda had always discouraged, claiming it was dangerous or unnecessary. I enrolled in cooking classes, discovering I had a talent for something Linda had always completely controlled in our home. 6 months after moving to Denver, I found a voicemail from Jake. His company was expanding, and he wanted to know if I would consider a partnership. "Two men who have learned to spot manipulation," he said with a laugh, "would probably be good at assessing the integrity of other businesses." The offer was tempting, but I politely declined. My new life wasn't about proving anything to anyone or capitalizing on past trauma. It was about rediscovering who I really was when no one was trying to mold me for their own purposes. A year later, I met Elena at a cafe near the community center construction site. She was a clinical psychologist who specialized in helping victims of psychological abuse. Our first conversation lasted 4 hours, not because we were romantically interested in each other, but because I had finally found someone who understood the subtle complexity of long-term manipulation. "The hardest thing," Elena explained to me during our third meeting, "is that victims of systematic manipulation often question their own perception of reality. You spent 8 years being trained to doubt your instincts." She was right. 4 months after the trial, I constantly questioned myself. Were there really signs I missed? Was I as naive as Sarah and Linda obviously believed? Could other people deceive me in the same way? But over time, and honestly, with the help of the therapy Elena kindly suggested, I began to understand that it wasn't naivety that made me vulnerable. It was kindness. It was the fundamental belief that people you love would not systematically deceive you for personal gain. "Don't let them destroy your ability to trust," Elena told me during one of our walks. "Let them refine your ability to choose whom to trust." 2 years after leaving Chicago, I received an unexpected letter. It was from Sarah, written from the federal prison where she was serving her sentence. She didn't ask for forgiveness or express remorse. Instead, it was a cold, detailed analysis of how she had manipulated me for years, written as if it were an academic case study. "You were always the easiest target in the family," she wrote. "You genuinely believed we were a loving family. Robert and I laughed at how predictable you were. Every time you brought me gifts on my birthday, or offered to help me with college problems, we were cataloging your emotional weaknesses. Reading the letter should have been devastating. Instead, I felt a strange sense of peace. Not because it confirmed my worst fears about my own naivety, but because I finally saw Sarah completely unmasked. There was no pretense, manipulation, or performance. Just the cold, calculating mind of a person incapable of genuine emotional connection. I burned the letter in the backyard of my new home in Denver, watching the ashes scatter in the mountain wind. Not out of anger, but as a ritual of closure. That version of myself that needed her validation or approval had died in the Chicago courtroom. The last time I heard from Jake was 6 months ago. He had married a high school teacher in Milwaukee, a woman who knew his whole story and chose to love him anyway. His business was thriving, now specializing in detecting corporate fraud for small family-owned businesses. "Funny how life works," he wrote on his wedding card. "I came to Chicago planning to destroy one family and ended up saving several others." Today, 3 years after that fateful day at the Grand Plaza Hotel, I drive home after a day overseeing the completion of my 10th construction project in Denver. The community center that started my journey here now serves over 300 families a month. Other projects have included 2 schools, a senior center, and a housing complex for veterans. Elena and I were married in a simple ceremony in the mountains, with only 20 people in attendance, true friends we met after moving to Denver. No members of the Miller family were invited. Not out of resentment, but because we understand that true family is the people who choose to support you, not those who share your last name. Sometimes on quiet nights, Elena asks if I feel anger for the time lost, for the 8 years of my life stolen by people who never genuinely loved me. The answer is no. Those 8 years taught me lessons I couldn't have learned any other way. They taught me the difference between kindness and naivety, between trust and vigilance, between biological family and chosen family. They taught me that the greatest revenge is not to destroy those who hurt you, but to build a life so authentic and rewarding that their attempts at sabotage become irrelevant. Linda, Robert, and Sarah will spend the next 15 to 25 years behind bars, probably planning their next manipulation for when they get out. I will spend those same years building communities, genuinely loving and being loved in return. If this story of family betrayal and total reconstruction touched your heart, subscribe to the channel to hear more stories of people who turned their greatest defeats into unexpected victories. Because sometimes, discovering who we really are only happens when they stop telling us who we should be. The last photo Sarah sent me from prison showed her smiling with the same radiant expression she had on her wedding day. Even behind bars, she was still performing, still trying to project an image that didn't match reality. I tore up the photo without a second thought. Some people never change. But the best people, the ones who deserve your love and trust, never stop growing.